traumatic brain injuries from Iraq and Afghanistan, the vast majority of them are concussion, 80%. And of those, 85% happen in garrison and training and are not from blast injuries. So it's just like a sport-related concussion. And the college kids and our servicemen and women, they're the same age, they're risk takers, very similar socioeconomic demographics. So there's a great similarity, and so we decided to come together and do a research program. Initially started as a $30 million research program, then went to $42.5 million, and is now about to go to $62.5 million. And what are we doing in this program? This is just a busy slide, but in essence, all of this, these are 30 schools that are participating in the program, and at the top there's an executive committee which includes myself, Walter Koroshetz, who's the head of the National Institute for Neurological Disease and Stroke from the NIH, and people from the military. We have no voting power in this study. It is being completely run from Medical College of Wisconsin, Indiana University, and University of Michigan. And the schools in yellow are doing highly advanced research, and every one of the schools are doing clinical research. And this is what's happening. You take a typical school, like University of Michigan, where you have about 1,000 student athletes. We look at every single student athlete, male and female, from every sport, and we have over 90% opt-in of athletes who want to be part of it. And it means they have to get an exceptionally intense baseline. If they get a concussion, they're re-examined at 6 hours, at 2 days, and so on over 6 months. They get blood collected if they're in the Advanced Research Corps, and they get brain MRIs. And they're wearing head accelerometers, and this is the model we're following in this concussion study. We're first looking at things like, well, what can predict your concussion recovery? Well, one of the things are pre-injury factors like genetics. I am reasonably confident that in 3 or 4 years we're going to have genetic profiles available for who is more likely to have a poor recovery from concussion. And then we make informed decisions. The trauma burden. For any of you who were concussed, I highly doubt that the physician really took a detailed history to assess the biomechanical forces of the trauma. Now, I was a ringside doc for many years, not because I wanted to, but because people took advantage of my high propensity to feeling guilty about things. So, you know, the nuns did a number on me. But, you know, still I am always grateful for having them in my life. But the trauma burden, the difference between getting a punch like that versus a roundhouse punch, it's night and day difference. We need to understand that. And biomarkers, what part of the brain is actually breaking down after a concussion? We're measuring that now. So that's one part. But the other is psychosocial. If you have ADHD, you're more likely to have a poor recovery from concussion. Actually, if you have clinical depression going into the concussion, you're more likely to have a poor recovery. Environmental factors like social support. How does that matter? Well, let's take a cue from metastatic breast cancer in women. We know for a fact that if you have metastatic breast cancer in women who require aggressive chemotherapy and you stratify them into women who have absolutely no social support and those who have a strong social support system, that the women with a strong social support system have a statistically significant increase in survival. So social factors make a difference, and motivational factors always makes a difference. And what are we measuring in this study? Not just neurological health, but quality of life, psychological health, neurobehavioral, neurocognitive. And where are we in this? So a large study before this study was 20 concussions. So we've looked at 33,000 athletes. We tracked over 2,400 concussions. It's in both sexes. If you look at the world literature in concussion, 95% of the world literature is devoted to men. And of that, 90% is American football and ice hockey. Women get concussed. Look at the concussion rates at the NCAA. What's the sport with the highest rate of concussion?
Soccer. Women's soccer.
men's wrestling, followed by women's ice hockey, right up there with men's ice hockey. And then, speaking of soccer, you have a few sports that have the same rate of concussion as men's football. Women's soccer, women's basketball, women's lacrosse, and men's football. So, we need to understand what happens in women, because they may concuss differently, both neurophysiologically and biomechanically. In fact, they do. So, it's a large study, and I'm not going to go into all the stats, but I want to show you, because most of it's embargoed data. It's all about to be published. This is embargoed too, so please do no one take a picture of this. And if you have, please delete it. This is embargoed. But let me just share with you the difference between the last time a reasonably large study was done in 2001 versus now. So back in 2001, 75% of athletes who were concussed returned to play in less than 1 week. Now 75% are returning to play after 1 week. That's a major cultural shift. Another thing is that in 2001, 60% of athletes were actually returning to play in less than 1 day. Now, 99% are returning to play after 1 day. We got to find out who that 1% is. Back then, there was about a 6.5% chance of getting a repeat concussion after you've had a first concussion, but 92% of them happened in the first 10 days. Now, you have about a 4.3% chance of getting a second concussion. Only 1 out of our 2,400 has happened in the first 10 days, and the mean interval for the rest is close to 60 days. It's like a second event. So, the culture is changing. Something good is happening. And there's going to be a lot of data published coming up in the next 6 to 12 months, which is actually going to radically shift our understanding of concussion. And I think is going to help to set policy. And speaking of policy, let me just share with you one thing that we did with concussion. We looked at preliminary data in football. There are 24 sports at the NCAA. Football is 90% of my headache, because it's a prominent sport, and it gets a lot of attention, and these big men, they just need a lot of attention, but we looked at the data, and we looked at the month of August. The month of August was responsible for 60% of the concussions, the vast majority of all of the deaths, and there were a number, and the majority of the musculoskeletal injuries. And we looked at other data. We looked at something besides concussion called repetitive head impact, which may be a very, very important marker, perhaps more so than concussion. And what we did after looking at that data, and we met with 21 football and medical organizations, and I had to go around the country and meet with the football coaches and said, you know what, we should take away 2-a-days in the preseason. They don't make sense. And the coaches said, wow, Brian, that's great news. No, they didn't. But after we showed them the data, they agreed. And in the regular season, we said 3 days of practice have to be non-contact or minimal contact. That is more stringent than what the Ivy League have been doing. The Ivy League did not eliminate contact. They eliminated tackling from their practice. So it's just a step. And I suspect that policy and a lot of else of what we're going to do is going to change a lot. So that's a little bit of concussion. I'm going to just share a couple other things because I really want to pause, I think, after this. And I know I should have spent more time on mental health, but I'll talk a little bit about mental health. But independent medical care, I have gone on record saying this is the single most important piece of legislation in the history of the NCAA. From my point of view. Why? Because it does two things. Every school must give unchallengeable autonomous authority to the primary athletics healthcare provider to make all medical decisions. You all are not the primary athletics healthcare providers. The way the legislation was originally written, you would have been with everyone else, because the original legislation, and they asked me to look at it, said all medical providers should have unchallengeable medical authority. And they said, Brian, what do you think? I said, that's going to be chaos. It means the social worker and the dietitian and the orthopedic surgeon and the cardiology consultant and the athletic trainer, they all have the same authority. Who's going to make the decisions? Someone has to be empowered, just like when I had a practice and I sent someone out for 3 or 4 consultations, I had to make the final decision. So we empowered the team physician and athletic trainers, and they have the ultimate authority. But then we did something else with this legislation. Every school now has an athletics healthcare administrator. This is a new position. It's kind of like having a compliance officer, if you will. But it's the first time there's been a position like that in sport. And it means that anytime we come out with a guideline, a best practice, that someone on the campus is responsible for making certain that it's done right and that it is done. And so let me just end briefly. I'm going to just speak 5 minutes on mental health. What do we know about mental health? Well, you all know this slide inside out. I know it living in New York. You can be feeling really great one day, you're driving your car. By the way, don't drive a car in New York, but you drive a car. And again, speaking of the Allman Brothers, so, if you don't know it, I'm an Allman Brothers fan. And so you're, listening to whatever, let's say Blue Sky again, and someone cuts you off and honks at you and, is yelling nasty things at you, and you say to yourself, you kind of just bow your head and grace and hope that that person has a better day. And it's cool. Next day, you're driving, and maybe now you're listening to Whipping Post and not Blue Sky, and you're a little agitated, you're sleep deprived, someone cuts you off, and you're talking about his mother. So, we're all, we all have that sort of yin and yang in us, and we need to recognize that. And athletes, it's the same thing for them, but athletes may have some issues that really need to be attended to. They're high visibility. There's this incredible pressure to perform. They're doing dual roles in academics and athletics, so their time demands are really big. And as you know, a lot of them identify themselves as athletes and not as soulful human beings. And when they get injured, what happens? Or when their sport stops, what happens? So we had this task force that I spoke to you about. And it was very cool. We went through some data, one of which is that suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death in our student athletes. But look at this big thing for accidents. How many of the accidents are caused by alcohol intoxication? Well, we know that 20% of Division I male student athletes extreme binge drink more than 10 drinks at a sitting. That's a lot. And we looked at some data that tell us something different. This is very generic data, but athletes aren't necessarily worse off than students who are not athletes. In fact, there's a little bit of a protective effect in depression. And that makes sense to me. If you're an athlete, you're really goal-directed, you know how to fall down, pick yourself up, you have camaraderie with your teammates. So this slide made a little bit of sense. We're a little protected against anxiety if we're athletes as well. But now we need to understand the nitty-gritty of sport-specific issues, like women's basketball, where if you poll women's basketball players, 50% of them trust their coaches, 50%. And you know, as well as anyone in the world, what trust means in a relationship. And if you don't have trust, or if you don't have trust, you just don't have a relationship, and then you're really alone. We know that men are more likely to be aggressive if they're athletes than if they're not athletes. So I don't understand this completely because we haven't actually worked through all the details on this. And we know that athletes just can feel overwhelmed. So we know that. But if there aren't people attending to the athletes who understand what it means to an athlete, because you can see a licensed mental health care provider and the person could say, well, gee, just take a few weeks off of practice, right? Well, no, that doesn't work. So there has to be a cultural knowledge of understanding this. And so we put together this book, Mind, Body, and Sport, which is available on ncaa.org/SSI for free. And we put together this mental health best practices document. And I think I'm going to stop here with this slide. This is the essence of the document. One is that these are very simple things. That health care should be provided by a licensed mental health care provider. Seems straightforward, but you go on most campuses, they don't know the difference between a sports psychologist who's a kinesiologist versus someone who has a license. And I'll just put this out there, if I put out a survey and said, if you have an athlete suffering from depression and anxiety, who would you refer them to? A sports psychologist, B, social worker. We have to ask ourselves that and say, what would most people respond? So we need to get the word out. We meaning us, together. And that is a goal. Clarify and disseminate referral protocols. How many of you are certified in CPR AED? So yeah, it should be 100%. So if someone goes into cardiac arrest, you don't think about what you need to do. You start CPR, or if you're alone and you know where an AED is, you get the AED anyway. If you do everything right in 3 minutes, there's a 92% chance of survival. If you do everything wrong in the first 8 minutes, there's a 100% chance of no meaningful survival or no survival. But what about an emergency action plan for a student athlete who's acutely psychotic and suicidal? Every single school should have a rehearsed emergency action plan for a mental health care emergency. But I'm not so sure that that's the case. And for routine referrals, where do you go if you're depressed? We talk about mental health screening tools. I think we have a long way to go with that. They're never standalone. And we talk about a health promoting environment, and we're really working with coaches. We actually, if you go on our website, I would love to hear your feedback about the 10-minute module we put together for every sport coach in the country on identifying mental health as a key issue. So this is what we put out, and I want to share with you what we're doing in November. We're having another mental health task force, and it's not to reinvent what we did here. It's actually to look at, because we have put as much as resources as we knew how to into getting this done right. And now we want to say, well, what's been the good of it? What has not worked out? And we want to operationalize this. Because I will continue to say publicly that mental health care is the single most important issue for our student athletes. More importantly, we want every student athlete to have access to mental health care as equally as easily as an ankle sprain. More importantly, athletics is a subculture and should lead the way in this country for what we need to do for mental health care, because this country is not doing it right. And we know that. I know that in my practice, where the majority of my patients were victims of the most horrendous abuse imaginable. And when they came to understand that there was a correlation between their neuropathic pain or their nociplastic pain and their limbic connections from abuse, and we finally got to that place, and I wanted to find a mental health care provider. Well, the wait was usually 3 months, and usually the person didn't accept insurance, and if they did, someone from the insurance company who was reading from a little booklet said, well, you have 6 treatments. Wow, 6 treatments. We're going to really get that understood in 6 treatments. So we need athletics to be a model. And then finally, I'm just going to end again by saying, well, so why am I here? And why are you here? Well, it's because I believe we have a narrative to continue. And it's a narrative that I pledge with you we will do together, because mental health is so key. You are critical to delivering mental health care to our student athletes. It must be your strategic plan that you become known, and you teach me how to let that be known. I am all ears, and I will do everything in my power, because we must have ample mental health care providers really for all of our students, but within the NCAA, also for our student athletes. So we're here together, we're stuck together. And this is now our narrative, we own it, and I thank you for inviting me to be part of it. We have maybe time for questions, comments, apples, eggs, tomatoes.
I have a question. The emergency plans, are there examples in the best practices to how to set up those?
No, so we don't have examples in the current best practices document, and one of the things that we're going to be doing in this meeting in November, and when we operationalize everything, is we're going to be looking and giving examples of basically campuses that have really done it in a way that really shows leadership and that can help others. So that's coming.
Okay.
Great question. Yes.
Dr. Hainline, thanks for being here. I have a question because I've worked in professional sports and at the college level. Can you talk about, I know you're not on staff at the NCAA, but can you talk about, for this group, what happens in terms of the communication down to the actual folks who implement the work that you guys are doing as far as research and these findings? How does that trickle down to actual practice and implementation for people who are in these roles?
Yes, so
Where,
when I talked about the independent medical care legislation, so one of our biggest problems, so for example, when we had our mental health best practices, and you know, you get really excited when a document comes out, you send it out, and so we send it to university presidents, athletic directors, senior women administrators, athletic trainers, team physicians. We don't know at every one of the 1,100 schools who actually delivered it. So now, for the first time, and I think this is going to take about 3 years to really kind of develop, with the athletics healthcare administrator, that person is responsible for taking all of this information and making certain that he or she works it through the system at the ground level. So for the first time in the history of the NCAA, we have one person identified for that role. It's kind of like a Title IX officer. If you didn't have a Title IX officer, who would be responsible for, you know, the policies regarding sexual violence, sexual harassment, and so forth? Now we have that person. 99% of the schools have given us the name of that person. We just actually sent out a few weeks ago a little handbook saying welcome to the community, and within that handbook there's a checklist of all of the things that we think the athletics healthcare administrator should be doing, and then we actually separately talked about the documents that are inter-association, so mental health, concussion, cardiovascular care. These are the things that are essential on your campus. Our plan is to progressively empower that person, actually to move it into in-person meetings, and so that's how it will happen at the grassroots level at the member schools. On the other hand, the Board of Governors, which is the most powerful committee of the NCAA, 16 university presidents, they hire and fire the president of the NCAA. They're responsible for all fiduciary oversight. They have the final say on all legal matters, and they can set association-wide policy. They have said that in the future, for any of these documents that come to the level of an inter-association where it has been completely worked in through the system, that it will become official association-wide policy. That is huge. So top down, bottom up, it's a process, but I'm actually cautiously optimistic about it.
thank you.
We're talking one more question if anybody has one.
Yes.
You said there 99% of the schools now have this athletics healthcare administrator. Is that information available for those of us who live in the different states and have relationships with some of the universities to get in touch with them?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. So let me find out, because I know so we have that information available. We communicate with them, but whether that is, there's a way to access that publicly, I will find out, and if you send me an email, remind me, say, yeah, I'm the individual who asked you the question that you had no clue about. And I will find out.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Dr. Hainline